Hi, welcome to the Becket Cook Show. I'm Becket Cook, and I'm back for episode number 2. How time flies. So, today I want to, on the Becket Cook Show, basically I examine the lies of the culture and try to find the biblical truth behind those lies. So that's kind of the thrust of the show, and today I want to look once again at an article from the New York Times, because the New York Times is a fecund orchard of material, and it's stunning. The cultural indoctrination of the Times is so stunning to me, and it's been happening for 50 years or plus. And basically it's just the non-violent version of the Soviet gulags, the re-education camps in the Soviet gulags, or Mao's Cultural Revolution in China. But I want to look at this article today, and it was in the design section of the New York Times, and it caught my eye. It came out a month ago, but it's funny because today it actually was reposted in the Times, and so. It's the story of a husband and wife team who had a clothing brand in New York called Millie, and how the wife broke free from her husband and her brand. And we'll get into it, but the title of the article is How the Designer of Millie Broke Free. So immediately when I saw the title, I was like, okay, there's something going on here, and it's probably not good. And it says, with her husband, Michelle Smith built a successful clothing brand on the idea of demure femininity. Then she ripped up her life. And the line where it says that the writer of this article is Catherine Roseman, it says, then she ripped up her life. And it's almost like that line, it's so celebratory. And you can tell that Catherine Roseman thinks that it's a great idea to rip up your life, which is bizarre, which is an upside down world, as per usual with the New York Times. And so apparently what happened is Michelle Smith was, she built this brand with her husband called Millie in New York. They had 2 kids. Their kids are 11 and 13 now. And then in 2013, she was in a Soul Cycle class, which by itself, the idea of Soul Cycle sounds very new agey to me. I've never been to a Soul Cycle class, but just the name alone just spells disaster. Yeah, if you're in a Soul Cycle class, maybe it's harmless. I don't know. But the name is weird. And she was in this class, and it says that she was wearing her Legalize Equality sweatshirt while she was in her spin class, and she ends up falling in love with the instructor of the class named Stacy Griffith. So she ends up leaving her husband for this Soul Cycle instructor and breaks up the family to follow her heart. And I always say it's a terrible idea to follow your heart, because according to the Bible, our hearts are wicked and are desperately wicked. And so it's always a bad idea to follow your heart. And so she just is willing to break up this entire family. And I don't know, and it doesn't mention what the husband, it doesn't say he was a terrible husband or that he was abusive or anything. It doesn't really say why they divorced. I think it's literally because she was in this spin cycle class at Soul Cycle and fell in love with her instructor and left her husband for this woman. His name is Andrew Oshrin, her husband. And that already there's an issue, because I took J.P. Moreland's apologetics class at Talbot School of Theology when I was in seminary. in 2017. And he mentioned this, and it just rang so true to me, that when a woman doesn't take her husband's last name, because her husband's last name is Oshrin and her name is Michelle Smith, there's already problems brewing. There's already, it's you're already setting yourself up for failure, because according to the Bible, when a man and a woman come together in marriage, it's a one flesh covenant. They become one flesh. And so if you kind of hold on to your name, you're not fully one flesh. And that always spells disaster to me when I see that, because even, there's so many people who hang on to their maiden names thinking that, it's some sort of statement, like a feminist statement, or like, I'm not giving up that part of myself. But it's like, yeah, but that's the whole point of marriage. You become one flesh, and it's dangerous to do that, I think. And to me, when I see that, I'm just like, here we go. There's beauty in becoming one flesh, and we'll get to that later. But so the article goes on to talk about Ms. Smith, not Mrs. Smith, but Ms. Smith. The New York Times is very careful never to use the term Mrs. Because that's too old-fashioned and traditional and sexist, according to them. So they would never use the term Mrs. They just use the word Ms. And so I don't even know, I can't remember when the term Ms. came into fashion, came into Vogue, probably in the 70s, from the National Organization for Women. I don't know where it came from, but so she has these kids, 11 and 13, and the article really just goes on to celebrate how Michelle Smith just really freed herself, got out of this marriage with this man, got away from this man, found this woman, and now her life is perfect, according to this article. And Michelle Smith and her girlfriend made it official on Instagram. I think in when was this? They made it official on Instagram, and it says Ms. Smith has chronicled her metamorphosis from creative director of a corporate brand and wife to unbound, free-handed designer and champion of personal freedom, love, and LGBTQ rights. So she's unbound now because she left her husband. She's unbound. And it goes on, the article goes on to say that it sort of details how she met her girlfriend and what that was like, and how they, kind of fell in love eventually. And at the end of the article, it does mention, because the whole article, you don't get any kind of understanding or any perspective on how this divorce is going to affect these young children. And it's so destructive. It's so destructive to the children. And, when I was growing up, my biggest fear in life was my parents divorcing. I mean, my parents, they had their moments of fighting, and it was scary because it's like, I think that's the child's biggest fear, because it creates so much insecurity, and happy parents that are married and loving, there's so much safety and security, and that it's so important for the development of kids. And I just remember worrying about that, but my parents stayed married till the bitter end. And, it was difficult. As they got older, it became difficult, but they refused to give in to the lie of the culture that, if it's hard, then just leave the person. Yeah, it was hard for my parents. My mother had Alzheimer's in the end, and it was very difficult for my dad, extremely, but they stuck it out till the very end. So back to the article. So they make their, Michelle Smith and her girlfriend make their their relationship public on Instagram, and they post photos of themselves at the New York City Ballet, and the caption is #LoveWins. Now we'll get into the idea of love wins maybe in another episode, but it's that term love wins is meaningless. Like, what does that even mean? It's so, it has zero meaning to it. But we'll get to that in another time. And it says that Michelle Smith finally feels comfortable in her own skin. So apparently all those years with her husband, and having 2 children and creating a company together and raising the children, apparently she never felt comfortable in her own skin for all those years, but now she finally feels comfortable in her own skin, which is always funny to me, because it's like, yeah, but how long will that last? Because let's check back. I mean, let's literally do this in a year or 2 years. Let's check back in and see where Michelle Smith is with her girlfriend. Let's see if they're still together and if she's still comfortable in her own skin. But the last line of the article, which I'll read, says it's just very disturbing. And I'll read the last line. It says, "I have found my own," Michelle is speaking, "I have found my own voice and my confidence to freely express myself in my personal life and my creativity. For the first time, everything has aligned and it feels amazing and true." So the lie feels true to her. It's a lie, and we'll get into why it's a lie in a minute. But first, let's ask the question: why does the New York Times? Why are they so bent on destroying the family, the traditional family? Like, what is their motivation? Why would they want to do that? And I have a couple of answers, but the first one is Marxism. And I have a copy of the Communist Manifesto right here. This is actually my copy from college. I don't know how I still have it, but it's a very thin little pamphlet of wicked lies. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels obviously wrote it, and in the Communist Manifesto, and Marx and Engels wanted to, one of their goals was to abolish the family. And literally it says that in here. There's a little section that says abolition of the family, exclamation point. And it goes on to detail what that means. And the reason they wanted to abolish the family is the natural hierarchy of the family is a problem, because it doesn't comport with the true family of the Communist Party, and in which the state owns all the means of production and controls all of life. So the family, there's a hierarchy. There's a mother and father and the children, and that hierarchy is bad for communism, because the hierarchy of communism is this. So, and I remember reading the Communist Manifesto. Also, another reason is capitalism and private property are necessary for the bourgeoisie, for the middle class. So they want to, obviously, in Marxism, they want to overthrow the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and capitalism and private property are part of that, and so are necessary for it. And I remember reading the Communist Manifesto in college, my freshman year. We all had to read it for some class, and I was really drawn into it. I remember thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is so perfect! It's beautiful! Like on paper, it looks so good." But the fatal flaw of this little book is it doesn't take into account man's nature, which is sinful and wicked, and so it's impossible to impose this philosophy of Marxism, of communism, onto human beings that are naturally sinful. And that, I mean, we've seen the results of that in the 20th century. There were millions and millions of people killed in the name of communism, because of communism in the Soviet Union, and under Lenin and Stalin, and in Mao's Cultural Revolution in China, and Pol Pot in Cambodia, and in other places. There were millions and millions of people were killed by various means. And I actually just finished reading The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, and it's an amazing book. It's about, this big. The book, it's this thick. There's actually an abridged version, which is slightly thinner, but it's still really long. But it's fascinating, and I highly recommend The Gulag Archipelago. But you see, when you read it, you're just like absolutely blown away by the just murderous, evil, wicked destruction of human life because of communism and because of this ideology. So, and there's the idea of the long march through institutions. And in 1967, this term "long march through the institutions" was coined by a German, and it's a strategy for revolution. And this has been going on since the 60s. There's been this long march through institutions in our society, especially through academia and other professions. And in my college, I would say that almost all of my professors were Marxists. They just were. And that trickles down, and it affects people. And people, when I graduated college, the Communist Manifesto didn't stick with me after college. I believed in free market enterprise and freedom, but with a lot of people, I think, when they read this book, it sticks with them. And I think, we've seen the results of that in our culture, and we've seen this long march through the institutions. And I think a lot of the writers at the New York Times and other places, but we're just going to focus on the New York Times. A lot of the writers, if not all of them, are basically Marxists, and at the very least secular humanists. But a lot of them are Marxist. And the Long March, the idea of the Long March, came from Mao's Red Army and his communist Red Army when they marched, I think, like 6,000 miles through China in 1934, 1935. That's where the term "long march through the institutions" came from. And so I think that's what's happened, obviously, to the New York Times is, and it's funny because the New York Times, they're always kind of perplexed. They have these articles about like the opioid crisis and how did this happen and where did, it's like, well, you caused it, New York Times. You caused the opioid crisis over 50 years of indoctrination, of attacking the family for 50 years and destroying the family, because when you destroy the family, you destroy society. The destruction of the family leads to mental illness, it leads to drug addiction, it leads to homelessness, it leads to all kinds of ills in society. And so the abolition of the family is where we are today. Look all around, especially in Los Angeles where I am now. It's like, it's all around me. And so you see its effects, and the long march through the institutions has worked over the last 50 years. And it's worked, and it's destroying our societies, destroying lives. And so, but the real root of all of this, the real root of even Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto is biblical, and it goes back to Romans chapter 1, where Paul talks about the whole idea of suppressing the truth. This is really the root of it all. Paul talks about, in chapter 1, he talks about suppressing the truth, and he talks about these three exchanges that happen when we suppress the truth. And he says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. So the writers in the New York Times, they're futile in their thinking because they don't honor God. And their foolish hearts were darkened. So they have darkened hearts. And claiming to be wise, these writers, what's her name again? The writer of this article is, gosh, I can't find it now. Catherine Rossman. She, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Because they exchanged, again, this is the second exchange, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Then Paul has one final exchange. This is controversial, but it's true. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. So Paul really unpacks why this is even the case. What is the human condition without God? We're suppressing the truth. And it comes out in all sorts of ways, including the Communist Manifesto and the New York Times. And so another issue in this article is feminism. And it's clear that the writer is a feminist and that Michelle Smith is probably a feminist. And, well, she is. You can tell from what she says, her quotes. But there are a couple kinds of feminism. There's equity feminism, which is equality. Feminism is just fairness between men and women. It's equality under the law. It's equality of opportunity. It's dignity, personal liberty. It's also known as, from Christina Hoff Sommers, it's also known as freedom feminism. And basically, this can also, it's also called first and second wave feminism. This is what those waves of feminism are. They're equity feminism. But there's another feminism that is extremely destructive, and it's where we are now. It's called gender feminism. And gender feminism is entirely different from equity feminism. Gender feminism pit men and women against each other. Men and women are opposing tribes. There's a universal patriarchal oppression against women. So there's men are universally oppressing women in our culture. And there's this idea of toxic masculinity. Basically, men are bad. Gender roles are arbitrarily defined. So the gender roles are a social construct, not instead of a biblical construct that God designed. According to gender feminism, it's just a social construct, the difference between men and women in their roles. And the purpose of gender feminism is to convince women that they are victims and that they are put upon by men in every aspect, that language has to be liberated, and textbooks and great works of art are all compromised by sexism. And so gender feminism is, we see it happening now in our culture, obviously, with everything going on. And it's so destructive. It's so anti-family. It's so anti-God. And it's and again, it's going back to Romans 1, it's suppressing the truth. Cicero said famously that the first bond of society is marriage. And when you break that bond, when you break that that foundation of society, society falls apart. And look where we are today. Society is falling apart very fast. And by the way, if you're a parent and you've sent your child away to college and are spending $200,000 for them to be a gender studies major, well, you've wasted $200,000 because your daughter is going to end up hating her father because he's a toxic man, and she's going to pity her mother for being a stay-at-home mother, for example. And the idea of stay-at-home mother is funny to me because it's like, what other kind of mother is there? I don't know when that phrase was coined, stay-at-home mother. I mean, my mother was a stay-at-home mother. But to me, she was just my mother, and she took care of us and nurtured us and loved us and was there for us, which was so important for our development and for our health and our mental health and our well-being. So the idea of and the New York Times spends, I don't know how much ink on denigrating the family, especially denigrating, quote, stay-at-home mothers. I mean, they just absolutely abhor stay-at-home mothers, and they look at them with such contempt and scorn. It's insane. And so anything that's the opposite of that, they will happily write an article on. If a woman is going to leave her husband and her kids for another woman, then let's write a 6-page article on that for sure in the style section. That's something to be celebrated and wonderful. So let's talk about marriage and what is marriage? What is biblical marriage, and what is the biblical sexual ethic, and why is it so? And of course, we have to go back to Genesis to look at biblical marriage. Genesis 2, if I can find it. So in Genesis 2, it says, "Then the Lord God said, 'It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him.' Therefore," and it goes on to say, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were naked and were not ashamed." So in biblical marriage, the man and the wife become one flesh. The man and woman become one flesh in this covenant of marriage. And as Tim Keller says, when you're in this covenant, you can be naked spiritually, emotionally, and physically with another person and not have this fear of abandonment, which is not the case in our kind of quid pro quo relationships today in society, where it's like, oh, like for example, Michelle Smith, it's like, oh, my husband is not making me happy anymore, and this woman is, and so I'm just going to leave. And so there's always this quid pro quo, like you better, continue to make my life good, and otherwise I'm leaving, I'm out. And so that's why it's so important to have this covenant and this safety within the covenant of marriage. And Jesus reiterates this Genesis 2 idea in the Gospels. He reiterates the biblical concept of marriage between a man and a woman, and they become one flesh. He literally quotes Genesis, and Paul quotes it again in Ephesians 5, and he takes it even a step further and compares marriage to the marriage between Christ, who's the bridegroom, and his church, who's the bride, and he calls it a profound mystery. And it's this marriage and so Paul in Ephesians 5, it's not a cultural, it's transcultural, because it's not just Paul talking about marriage in his day in antiquity, traditional marriage. He's grounding it in the creation narrative of marriage, creation story, and grounding it in God's design for marriage in Genesis 2. So it's not just something of that time, but it's something that's transcultural, and there's not this cultural distance from it. And so there, the other thing is the biblical sexual ethic. Why did God created sex, and sex is good. God created it, it's good, but he created it to be expressed within these certain boundaries. And why did he do that? He did it for our flourishing, and because he wanted us as human beings to have well-being and flourishing in this world, and anything outside of that, that covenantal marriage between one man and one woman for life is destructive. Whether it's premarital sex, whether it's extramarital sex, whether it's homosexual sex, whatever that is, anything outside of that is destructive. And you see the destruction. I mean, I lived that life for so long. I lived as a gay man for so many years before I got saved in 2009, and I thought that I was sexually liberated. I mean, I had so many boyfriends and had so many affairs, and I thought I was sexually liberated. It wasn't until after I became a Christian that I looked back on it and I was like, wow, I was in sexual bondage. That was sexual slavery. That was not sexual freedom. And I just look back on that with just stunned. And the destruction, the amount of destruction of that it's incalculable. I mean, I didn't even realize this until after I became a Christian, but the emotional scarring of kind of all of those relationships I cycled through and all those different sexual encounters I had, it really had this profound effect on me and was very damaging emotionally and psychically. And so all, this article once again is just another lie from the culture, and this is just one of millions of lies that come at us every day, and it's affecting even people in the church. I mean, this indoctrination and this re-education affects people in the church. I've seen it so many times happen, and I've seen the bad fruit of that, and the divorce rate of Christians, and it's just, we have to kind of take a step back and say, where are we? We're in a very specific time and place and culture and history, and what's influencing our belief systems? Is it the New York Times? Is it TV shows? Is it movies? Or is it this? Is this influencing our belief systems, our thinking, our renewing of our minds, as Paul says? Are our minds being renewed by the Word of God, or are our minds being renewed by lies from the world? So we have to keep that in mind. And I hope today was helpful. And please share, like, and subscribe to the Becket Cook Show. And I'll see you next time. I have a lot more to say about a lot of these issues, but we will see you next time. Thank you so much for tuning in, and see you next time. Thank you.